Welcome to Jewish Cork. The first two Jews who arrived in Cork were Portuguese cooks from the Duke of Schomberg's army in the late 1600s. There was no real Jewish community at that time until 200 years later. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Jews left their homes in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and in search of new opportunities. Some of them, mostly from Lithuania, found their way to Cork City, landing at Cove. On this walk, we're going to introduce you to some of the history, the poetry, the music and the stories from members of the community then and now.
This is the Trinity Bridge. It's also known as the Passover Bridge. It was erected in 1977 and opened by the first and only Jewish Lord Mayor of Cork, Gerald Goldberg. He was born in 1912, and he was one of 12 children from Lithuanian parents. He qualified in 1937 as a solicitor and practiced for 63 years. He was not only the Lord Mayor of Cork, but he was also the president of the Hebrew congregation. Gerald Goldberg was known to stand up for those who didn't have a voice, and he was also known to speak up when something was wrong.
When I was very young, I remember being 4, 5, 6 years of age, and it was a very religious community, and at Rosh Hashanah, in the afternoon, after Mincha, the men used to walk out of the synagogue, turn left, and just go straight to the river. Old men in wide hats walked purposefully to the river. They stood in line between chain and quay, the words of prayer held in cold hands as water lapped their feet at high tide. They intoned together the ancestral tongue while shaking out the lining of their pockets, ridding themselves of sins gathered and stored since last year. They gestured them away like swatting flies, Pflicht, Pflicht, feeding them to the green flowing God. Herring gulls wheeled and dived and sang above the holy mumblings. They prayed in flight. Their irreverent cause drifted down the darkening October sky. The men returned the linings to their clothes, shook hands, smiled at each other. A cigarette, a light, a cough, a caw of smoke, and it was done. Another year of sin thrown out, already forgotten, eaten by gods, washed by water, as it is written.
The mikveh, the Jewish ritual bath, mainly used by women, was in the back of the Turkish baths on the South Mall, where Jacob's on the Mall restaurant now stands. There was a back entrance over there on Father Matthew Quay so that women could enter the mikveh, called the private Jewish bath, without having to go through the public Turkish bath area.
When Jewish families started to migrate to Cork in the late 1800s, the men of the community would meet in someone's living room for services. When the community became big enough, two congregations developed, Cork Hebrew Congregation and Remnant of Israel. By 1911, there were approximately 450 Jews in all of Cork, and in 1915, the two congregations combined into one, the Hebrew congregation, and settled here at 10 South Terrace. However, after the 1920s, the Cork Jewish community started to dwindle as people left for places such as Dublin, London, Manchester, and Israel. And by February 2016, the synagogue here on South Terrace opened its doors for the last time.
Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabala. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabala.
I'm Phyllis Rosenberg. I was born in Cork, daughter of David Rosenberg and from Dublin and Jessie Rosenberg from Cork. My brother became a dentist in Cork and left there to live in England in 1964. I went to a Protestant school called Christchurch and a Catholic school called Skalvira, and both of them were in the city centre, and I was the only Jewish pupil in my class throughout. And then in 1966, I left Cork to live in Manchester in the UK and I am still living there. The property next door to the synagogue during one period became a bakery. To have the smell of fresh baked bread wafting into the synagogue, particularly on the fast day of Yom Kippur, was added torture.
Here in the area behind the synagogue, Kemp Street, there was an old Jewish graveyard from the period before the Cork Hebrew congregation, probably from the 1700s. We don't know how many people were buried in that cemetery, unfortunately. Later, this area became a bacon curing factory. Later still it was a car park, and now it's being made into a housing estate. The Cork Hebrew congregation purchased land for burial in the 1880s, and that's a few miles outside the city in a beautiful elevated area in Cork. Many well-known and less well-known members of the old community are buried there, as were some Jewish victims of the Lusitania tragedy in 1915. Lahavdil, which means on a completely different subject, on the other side of the housing estate there, on Douglas Street, there's a pub called the Gables, and a klezmer music session took place there every Tuesday evening, back in the day in pre-COVID times, from 2019 until early 2020.
The land that Shalom Park is on used to be owned by the Cork Gas Company. In 1989, they gave it to the Cork City Council, who turned it into the park. The name commemorates the Cork Jewish community, who had originally settled in this part of the city. They arrived as refugees from Lithuania, and this whole area is still known locally as Jewtown. Shalom is Hebrew for peace, and it is also a greeting to say either hello or goodbye. On the Sabbath we say Shabbat Shalom, or in Yiddish, Good Shabbos, wishing our fellow friends a peaceful and good Sabbath. And I can imagine the Jews travelling from Jewtown and heading over to the synagogue, wishing each other a good Shabbos before going to a service.
The Evening Echo installation is a public artwork by New Zealand artist Ruti Lachs. Inspired by Cork Jewish history, 9 lamps were erected in 2010. The tallest one is only lit once a year on the last night of Hanukkah at a public event. The intention of this artwork is to maintain a delicate but persistent visibility in the park and to reactivate its connection to Cork's Jewish history. Following the lighting of the lamp, the local and Jewish community are invited back to City Hall for a social event, which includes the lighting of Hanukkot, the Hanukkah candelabras.
Preservation. Cork, 1920. When this is over, I'll go by steam train to the seaside in Yule, Kinsale, or Baltimore, to stroll on the sand or watch the children splash and paddle, or I will lie on a hotel bed listening to the waves. But I won't go to Cove, where the boat brought me from Kovno, and the guard made me change my name to Feldman, and the boy who took my shadel and tossed it into the sea. If I went back again, what else would they take away?
So when the Jews from Europe first settled in Cork in the late 19th century, most of the men became peddlers, salesmen, also known as Winkelmen, because they were selling household necessities and luxuries on their weekly rounds. They'd sometimes be away all week and come back on Friday to spend Shabbos, the Jewish Sabbath, in their homes, and then off again on the Sunday. Each week the purchaser would pay off a bit of the price, sometimes with interest, sometimes not, sometimes they paid, sometimes they didn't pay. These Jews who lived in this area were poor. They'd arrived in Cork with nothing, a lot of them. The tiny houses may have housed a family of 8 children and a lodger. There may have been a few chickens in the backyard. But at the height of community, over 450 Jews lived in Cork, not all here. As the second generation became more educated, became more affluent, they moved to other areas of the city. One of the houses here in Jewtown, known as the Rabbi's House, is where the services were held on Shabbos, on Shabbat, before the synagogue in South Terrace was bought.
Landsmannschaft. This place may not have skyscrapers, the Brooklyn Bridge, or dreams of gold, diamonds, precious stones. So we find pebbles by the river, skim the flat ones as far as they go, and we laugh with our neighbours. Though we don't speak their language, they tip their hats to us like friends. Cousin, I think you'd like it here. At the sad deconsecration ceremony and closure of the Cork Synagogue in 2016, and the ultimate disbanding of the Cork Hebrew congregation, a small and dedicated group formed the Munster Jewish community to keep Judaism alive in Cork and surrounding counties. Since its formation, more Jews in Ireland are making contact as they hear about the community, and we currently have members from Australia, America, Argentina, Israel, Iraq, Russia, Poland, Germany, France, Spain and England, who have all chosen to live and work in Cork and the surrounding counties. Although we don't yet have our own synagogue building, just like all diaspora communities, we meet where we can and continue to celebrate major and minor festivals, with rabbis from England and America also occasionally visiting and leading services and discussions.
Memories of attending synagogue in Cork in the late 50s and 60s include my mother and I walking as per religious tradition the 2-kilometre journey one particular Jewish New Year in autumn in our new clothes and the inevitable rain. Our lovely Catholic neighbour stopping and offering us a lift to wherever we were going, and my mother having to refuse, and he continuing on, obviously very bewildered and perplexed.
Mary Elms was born May 5th, 1908 in Ballin Temple, Cork. In 1928, she attended Trinity College in Dublin. Then, in the 1930s, she received a scholarship to attend the London School of Economics. By 1935, Mary Elms received a certificate in international studies before traveling to assist Spanish Civil War refugees. During the 1940s, she was arrested by the Gestapo on suspicion of espionage, but that did not stop her from smuggling Jewish children and adults out of France in the boot of her car to evade Nazi deportation. Mary Elms was not known to accept medals during her life because it was the right thing to do. Her bravery saved the lives of over 400 children and adults.
This bridge was opened in September 2019 as a pedestrian and cycling bridge honouring Mary Elms. Among those at the opening were members of Mary Elms' family, as well as one of the survivors who was rescued aged 4 or 5 by Mary and other volunteers in France in 1942. Also at the opening of the Mary Elms Bridge were Cork locals, dignitaries and members of the Irish Jewish community. There's so much to tell and so little time, but more information about the Cork Hebrew congregation is on permanent display at Cork Public Museum in Fitzgerald's Park. It's called The Tsars, the Rose Hills and the Music Shop. There are items there from the synagogue and a lot more history than we've shared here. In Cork we have regular klezmer music sessions, and the Munster Jewish community can be contacted through their website. Thanks so much to everyone involved, and also to those not directly involved for their encouragement. Please do get in touch via the webpage. Sei gesund.